Alright, I am making this video targeted at a Facebook posting that I saw, and believe it or not, it goes through a lot of stuff that's clearly a case of the people who wrote it don't clearly understand the problems with it and or consequences. And like some the first line that gets me is the that people think the insurrection or coup at the Capitol on January 6th would have been better off, we would be better off if it would have succeeded. And in reality, that's not really the case. And the thing is, if you really think turning to dictatorship is a real good idea, you really have a very romanticized idea of what a coup or an insurrection entails, because it's a situation where clearly only the first move was planned and there was no end game for plan. Okay? And when it comes to a situation like that, you need a plan, you need an end game planned, because otherwise things can spiral beyond control very quickly. A good example is okay, and like to kind of tag along with it, I've heard people say, well, I think we would have been better off if it would have been successful. And actually, the answer is no. And the reason for that is, first off, US currency would have gone from being what it's worth today to being worth, from a dollar being worth what it is today to being worth about half a euro cent overnight. Okay. That's the thing. If you really are if you're seriously planning some sort of revolt, rule number one, get hard currency, because your currency will no longer be a hard currency. The second issue is the fact that any trade we have would have ended. Um, the only trading partner we would have had left on the board rather quickly would have been Russia, and they really don't have anything to trade, so basically we'd be forced into an economic depression very quickly. Now, there's a few other things that come up that the people that write about them don't really understand. And I'll explain them one at a time. One I heard was the idea of military tribunals for senators and representatives. Okay, first off, not many people understand, whoever wrote this didn't really understand what a military tribunal is used for. In the US, there's legally only one thing they can be used for, and that is war crimes. Okay? And a prime example of a war crime was at the coup on January 6th, 2021. What happened was there were people using bear spray against the Capitol Police. Because bear spray is not authorized to be used on humans, it becomes use of chemical weapons, which is a war crime. Okay, and when it comes to war crime, the judge advocate general of the military has to oversee it. So, they're a lot more complicated than what they think. What they were more pushing for was show trials against politicians they just didn't like, and the thing about it is we end up, all of us have politicians that we don't like, that we don't really have a say in whether or not they get elected. But and that's mainly because we're a federation of states where the way one state votes is different than the way the other state votes. And that's how it's been since forever. Okay, so there's not really anything most people can do about it. Then there's the issue with what the majority of America is thinking. Well, what the actual majority is a bit different between what people think is what the Republican Party sells as the majority. And the best example is since 2004, when it comes to when it comes to like House and Senate elections, Democrats actually usually get more votes. Okay, the problem is outside of Texas and Florida, most Republican representatives, their districts have about 650,000 voters, whereas the average district run by a Democrat has about 1.2 million voters. So basically you have to get the total number of votes that are available in a Republican district to get to win in a Democratic district. Okay. Another issue is like the Senate, again, with the exception of Florida and Georgia, most of the Democratic senators come from much larger states. and because of that, they have to get more votes. So the Senate and the House both are not an accurate depiction of how people actually vote. All right, and that's just the way that things are land. I mean, yes, there are a few relatively small districts that Democrats tend to dominate in, such as Delaware and Rhode Island. Again, these are states with single that only have one representative. Okay, and which I think the thing about representatives is one thing, but the thing about states, about senators, is there are certain states like Florida, like Texas, like California, like New York, like Illinois, like Georgia, like Arizona, the big states. I mean, yeah, they should be allowed more senators than the smaller states um, because then it is a case of minority rule. Okay. Now, the idea of throwing everyone you don't like in jail is a play straight out of the dictator's handbook, you know, and there's a lot of plays number one, the fascist handbook, and then the dictator's handbook that people don't seem to notice, but one of the biggest places where you're in a dark place is when you can't deal with disagreement. Okay? And like another thing with Trump in particular, any news media outlet that didn't like him, he labeled fake news. When in reality, and then on top of it, he wanted to create his own media outlet that was very supported of him. Well, the thing is, in dictatorships, it's, dear leader has the number one and only TV program, the number one and only book available, wrote the number one play, and which is running for the next 50 years, and it's also the top seller. That's how you can tell that someone's trying. Those are signs of dictatorships. Another thing was basically the cult of personality. Like, usually, if there's a statue of one person in every square and that person happens to be the current leader, it's a good chance he's probably a bad guy. And then the next issue is usually whatever comes in to knock it out is a hell of a lot worse than the dictator that you started out with, and before you know it, you're back to Ivan the Terrible, whether you like it or not. So, and yes, this can happen anywhere because it has happened a lot of places, but people don't realize that the only thing that gets rid of a dictator is an even worse dictator. And the last thing I'll get to is, a lot of people either don't understand, a lot of people that don't understand is right now, if there was another attempted coup in the US, it would most likely fail. And what happens is either because of the constant failures, the group either gets more desperate, but usually after the first failed coup attempt, what happens is the people involved have to usually commit suicide, and then the remainder of them disappear. They try to avoid it. They try to no longer talk about it because they're trying to avoid any potential personal repercussions or consequences. And when I say consequences, it's like usually in this situations, just people who are mild supporters end up getting thrown in prison for the next 10 years. That's what normally happens in this situation. All right, thank you and goodbye.